And we're looking at physically restrained, okay? So we're looking at daily, and it's very important to remember that we're talking about daily restraint use. I just want to mention one more time, as I have in several classes and before this day, when we've taught the class the last time, is that there is no such thing as a restraining device. Now, I know that's not what we're typically accustomed to saying. We call certain things restraining devices, such as lap belts and so forth. However, it's not the device that's the restraint, but the effect that a device would have on a person. So regardless of what the device is. So for example, we're looking at a reclining chair here on the screen. If I sat a person into that reclining chair and reclined it back on, let's say, 20-degree angle, and I put a lap belt on the person, and that person was able to undo the lap belt themselves and raise the chair and get out of it, then the person is not restrained. So the device is irrelevant in that case. If the person was sitting in that chair and had quadriplegia with no physical movement at all, and I put them with the lap belt and recline the chair back 20 degrees, they would not have been able to get out of the chair even if they could gain access to the apparatus to release the belt and to raise the chair up. So they're just simply not capable of doing that. Therefore, they're not restrained. Now, if a person was sitting in that chair and it wasn't reclined and there was no belt on them, and they could simply just get up out of the chair and walk away, and then at some later time you put the belt on them and recline the chair more than 20 degrees, now they're not able to get access to the device, then they are restrained. And so this is a question that's been going on and on and on, and each time I have a class where I have 40 or 50 nurses in it, it seems that we're still not understanding that there are no devices that are restraints. There is simply the effect that the situation or the device has on the person. Okay, so having said that, if there are any questions, please email me. I'm just paul@medicare.com. Or you can leave a question in the chat line here, and then Heidi will forward questions to me. So once again, we want to just quickly now, since some of us have been here several different times, we're looking at two major types of quality indicators from the 35 quality indicators. And we're looking at prevalence indicators, which means we're looking at the result only on the current assessment and one assessment only. And we're looking at incident indicators, which means there's going to be two assessments, and we're looking back from the current assessment to the immediate prior assessment. And these incident assessments come in two flavors. Those that look at improvement, which generally means you have a lower score on the MDS, and those that look at decline in functional status, which generally means you have a higher score on the most recent assessment relative to that immediate prior assessment. Now, with the prevalence indicators, there are three exclusion factors. So any assessment that has an ARD date less than 93 days after the admission date will be excluded. So you've got to have an ARD date 93 days or more after the admission date. Or one could just say the person has to have a length of stay of at least 93 days. We never use the initial 14-day assessment as part of the quality indicator reporting at CIHI. So that particular assessment is never used, either in your software, I'm assuming, or at the CIHI reporting system. And the very last factor will exclude any assessment for a person. If there's more than one assessment, we will only use the last assessment. So any prior assessments in that quarter will not be used. And so an example of where that might happen would be where you did a quarterly assessment, and then during that same So if I'm correct, the broadcast just started. And just one moment, please. I apologize, everyone. Apparently, no one's heard anything that I said for the last 10 minutes. And I'm hoping that we've heard these same slides several times so we don't have to start again at the very beginning. So I'm going to carry on past here to the next slide. And we're talking about who's excluded on an incident indicator. Assessments that were carried out, again, just like for the prevalence indicators, you have to be in the building 93 days or more. Initial assessment will not be counted for an incident indicator unless it's the look-back assessment. But any reporting period where that assessment for the current assessment is an initial, they are excluded. Once again, we'll only use one assessment within a quarter. Also, we're looking here when it's a prevalence indicator and we need to look back. That prior assessment has to be at least 45 days ago. So it can't be less than 45 days between assessments. And the last assessment can be no more than 165 days ago, or that record will be excluded from the reporting period. We've talked about population risk adjustment before, where CIHI calculates both the provincial average and a theoretical average for an indicator, and they're going to adjust your score depending upon those background information. So if you have more people with dementia, then we expect you to have more falls. If you have less people with dementia than the theoretical, then we would expect that you would have less falls. So your numbers are adjusted for certain contextual factors to make comparison to one facility and the other a fair comparison. As we've talked before, we have a rolling quarter. That is, there's always 12 months of data included in the CIHI reports and the Health Quality Ontario reports. And so we've shown this example with the prevalence indicator several times, where the data for Q1 makes it sound like we're only using data collected in Q1, but every report always has a full 12 months of data. So data from a prior reporting period from CIHI will include 9 months of that prior period's data in the current reporting period. It's almost the same thing for the incident indicators, where we're going to include a fifth quarterly in there. This is not counted in the denominator of the statistic. It's just so that this quarter can have a look back for that particular incident indicator. So today we're looking at a prevalence indicator again, so there is no look back to a prior assessment. We're looking at daily physical restraints. So remember, this item is no physical restraint Less than daily physical restraint, daily physical restraint. Okay, and you can see that we've already covered the pressure ulcers and antipsychotic utilization. We're not looking at any of the improvement indicators, and we haven't covered any of them in the past. And we're not looking at any of the 14 decline indicators today as well. We'll look at them as we go forward. But we have covered decline in pressure ulcers before. So let's just go on to daily physical restraint. It's just percent of residents in a daily physical restraint. Really, really simple calculation. Once again, too, we want to look at the Health Quality Ontario benchmark. There is a benchmark for has a daily physical restraint. And if you look at what your restraint use is, you can see the benchmark is 3%. So that's where Health Quality Ontario is moving towards. Currently, in the most recent report on CIHI, the daily physical restraint use was at 5%. And if you've been following along on the areas of care that can be most influenced by nursing care, you can see that this is one of the areas in which nursing care has a great deal of control over. So it's the third ranked or third and a half ranked physical indicator. It ties the antipsychotic utilization for ease of altering. Okay, and there's the reference at the bottom of the slide, Estabrook and Company. And you can also see that physical restraints is one of the risk indicators that we'll be looking at. So there are RAPs and CAPs that are related to this particular indicator as well. So one question that came from CIHI that covers what I've already mentioned. What is the definition of physical restraint was the question. And the answer was, please note, the definition of physical restraint has been updated by INTERI, the people who developed the indicators. Please note the revised definition and remove any previous definitions from your teaching material. This is from CIHI on the eQuery, and recall that it's eQuery 38470 if you need to look it up. So a physical restraint in this case is defined as any manual method or physical or mechanical device, material, or equipment that is attached or adjacent to the resident's body, that the resident cannot remove easily, and that restricts the resident's freedom of movement or normal access to his or her body. It is the effect the device has on the resident that classifies it into the category of restraint, not the name or the label given to the device, nor what the purpose or intention of the device was meant to be. So strictly, it has to do with the effect on the resident. Also, please note if the resident has no voluntary movement, specifically they're comatose, quadriplegic, you're going to code P4C, P4D, and P4E as not used. Now, I know the wording is ridiculous. The thing is, it is used, but it doesn't prevent the person from releasing themselves from the situation. So the problem is their wording where they say the restraint is not used. You can see that the person has a lap belt on. However, the person can remove the lap belt and get out of the situation. Therefore, they're not restrained. It's not about having a restraint. So there are some exclusions, and we've already mentioned them. On section I1, under item BB, quadriplegia. If a person has that item checked off on that assessment, that most recent assessment, they're going to be excluded from the calculation. Also from B1, comatose. If that item is checked off as yes, then they will be excluded from the calculation as well. So other than the first three exclusions we talked about, length of stay, most recent assessment and such, these other two exclusion factors are also used in the calculation. So a very, very simple calculation. We're looking in section P4, devices and restraints. And here you're going to see that it's the C, trunk restraints, D, limb restraints, and E, chair prevents rising are the three items. Okay, and you also note that they're a risk item as well as a quality item. So let's go down. The calculation is very simple. On the current assessment, if the MDS item trunk restraint or limb restraint or chair prevents rising occurred on a daily basis, it's as simple as that. When we look at the wraps, you can see that we're going to use the item trunk, limb, and chair prevents rising as indicators, which seems a little silly to me as well as a risk indicator, because if you have the problem, then you have the problem. So the risk would be 100%. So a very silly indicator on the wraps, and probably why we're getting rid of the wraps. Okay. So let's just look at here for the risk indicator. The only thing that makes the risk indicator different from the quality indicator is the fact that if they're used less than daily. So if you've been marking off on the assessment that the person has restraints but they're used less than daily, then that is a risk indicator, and that one makes sense. The fact that they actually have a quality indicator doesn't really make it much sense as a risk. You can see also, if you're not in Ontario and you're in one of the other provinces, there are what are called caps. Now, caps are technically the same as wraps, but this time you can see there's three possible outcomes related to a cap. That is, it's not triggered. It's triggered to remove the restraint for persons with little or no active ability to perform the mid and early loss ADLs. So remember, the early loss ADLs are items such as hygiene, and the mid loss ADLs are things such as walking and locomotion. So if you have a person with little or no ability to perform those, then they're going to trigger a 1. And the item, the work that should be done, or the task, is to look to remove the restraints. You're going to code them a 2, triggered to remove the restraints for person with ability to perform the middle and early loss ADLs. So if you do have the ability, then it's triggered to remove them. If you don't have the ability, it's triggered to remove the restraints for person under that condition. So just notice that comatose is here, that's one of, and then quadriplegia is here, so these are high-risk people, they're saying. Trunk restraints being used is another risk factor, and chair prevents rising is another risk factor. And then the ADL hierarchy scale, which includes those early and mid-loss, which includes the early and mid-loss ADLs, this ADL hierarchy score. Okay, and you can see here on the right, it's locomotion on the unit, self-performance score, eating self-performance, toileting self-performance, hygiene self-performance. So if you're a 4 or an 8, that means you're totally dependent in that area. And if you're less than that, then that means that you're not totally dependent in those areas. Okay, and the ADL self-performance hierarchy scale ends up from a 0 to 6 score, where a person goes from independent, supervision, limited. There's an extensive 1 level, extensive 2, a dependent level at 5, and 6 means totally dependent. And so some combination of those scores will trigger the caps. So those are the risk indicators, the wraps and the caps, and we've seen how to calculate the quality. The fourth factor that we need to look at for items is the funding level. And if we look at the RUGS 44 groups that are there, 34 in a nursing home, you can see there is no direct, oh, that should say direct, there is no direct relationship to funding. So those three items, the C, D, and E items from P4, do not directly impact funding at all. There are obviously other factors that would impact funding, such as being in a comatose or being quadriplegic, but those would exclude you from the quality indicator. So those items have no relationship whatsoever to the funding model or to RUGs. Now, if you do have questions, please leave them with Heidi, any clarification or mistakes that I might have made. And then as well, you can always email myself, paul@medicare.com. Thank you all for attending today. I am sorry about the beginning with the silent film that we did. I'm glad that we were able to catch that the meeting had not started and most of the meeting was under the audio component. I'll see you all again next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.